Hey everyone, this is your host, Yashanka Chalasani, or otherwise known as Yash, and you're listening to another episode of the Yash and Company podcast. This is a show where we learn from extraordinary young adults. By this, I mean professional athletes, people on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list, or, as we have on today's episode, America's most well-known young chemist and professor. And occasionally, we will be joined by some industry experts, but those that specifically tailor their advice towards young adults. And before we get started with today's episode, I just want to take a quick moment to share a message from our sponsors that y'all are going to love. So, as y'all know, it's officially spring, and that means it's time to get outside and finally enjoy some good weather. I'm sure some of y'all have actually started seeing some hammocks around town, and maybe even thought about getting one yourself. Maybe you heard of Inu or some of these other companies, but paying over $100 for a hammock and straps, that's ridiculous. That's why I want to tell you about the best hammock I've ever tried. It's made from our friends at Octopus Outfitters, a company that was actually started by a college student at Baylor. And these guys are the real deal. They make hammocks that are sturdier than Inu for half the price. And here's the kicker. They come with all the major parts like tree straps already included, so you don't have to pay extra. I don't know of any other brand that's doing that. Octopus is actually extending a special offer for our listeners. So go to octopusoutfitters.com and use the code YASH to get 15% off your purchase. Our next sponsor is Establishing Company, and they're making your college experience last a lifetime. I'm sure many of y'all remember meeting your roommate for the first time, going to your first Rush event, enjoying a day out at the football tailgate, and maybe you've even walked the stage of graduation. But no matter what, these are the best years of your life. And Establishing Company is bringing school spirit back through the ultimate college apparel experience. Founded in 2017 by two Baylor students, Establishing Company seeks to provide trendy apparel with retro flair to past, present, and future students. Check them out at establishingcompany.com today to get the best spirit wear you won't see at the university bookstore. So if you're a guy or a gal looking to buy some great Baylor gear, or maybe you're just someone trying to give a gift to a friend or a graduating senior, I highly recommend you check out Establishing Company. And I personally can't wait to go try some of these clothes out because they just launched their summer line and they look phenomenal. So go check them out at establishingcompany.com and use code YASH to get 15% off your entire order. And if you're looking for some more information about our sponsors, I recommend y'all check out the show notes where we have literally everything and anything. But with that, let's get right to our episode. So on today's show, we'll be joined by Dr. Dr Garg, who can be found on Twitter at GargLab. And he received his BS in chemistry from New York University. During his undergraduate years, he spent several months in Strasbourg, France, while conducting research at Université Louis Pasteur as an NSF REU Fellow. Dr. Garg obtained his Ph.D. in 2005 from the Cal Institute of Technology, and he joined the faculty at UCLA in 2007. He has served as vice chair of the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry and has served as faculty in residence in the UCLA undergraduate community, which we'll actually talk about on the show because I think it gives him a very unique experience of college life. And in 2018, Dr. Garg was appointed as the inaugural holder of the Kenneth N. Trueblood Endowed Chair in Chemistry and Biochemistry and is the recipient of Baylor's prestigious Cherry Award, which is given to one of the best lecturers in the nation. He has also published a very popular TEDx talk titled Challenging Your Perceptions, which we will get to on the podcast. And he was actually recently awarded NYU's Distinguished Alumni Award, which actually puts him on the same list as NYU's brightest, such as Alex Baldwin and Spike Lee. So if you're pre-med, you probably heard of Dr. Garg because he's the creator of Bacon. But if you are not familiar with him, I am really excited to share this episode because I think Dr. Garg is a lot more than what the bio reads. I think he has such a unique perspective on life, and that's what's actually kind of led to a lot of success that he had. So on this podcast, we go through all sorts of random things as we always do. But some highlights to look forward to is his view on conflict resolution that he's getting some unique perspective on from his time as an RA and also now living at UCLA as a faculty in residence. He also has a very unique perspective on diversity, and his TEDx talk is actually a gem, and we actually dive really deep into that. But yeah, if you know me, you know that I always joke around that Dr. Garg will win a Nobel Peace Prize one day. And so on this podcast, I actually got to ask him about that. So you have that to look forward to as well. But without further ado, here is a very interesting conversation with Dr. Dr Garg. Hey everyone, this is Yash, and I'm in Waco, Texas, recording this episode in the office of Dr. Dr Garg. Dr. Garg, thanks for joining me on the show.
No problem, Yash. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, and I thought a good place for us to start this podcast would be where I first got a chance to hear from you, and that's when you came down last year for this Cherry Award presentation, and you actually presented to my class. But for those that might not know, what is the Cherry Award?
Sure. So the Cherry Award is a teaching award given by Baylor University. It's named after somebody named Robert Foster Cherry. When, I guess around the time when he passed, he gave a substantial amount of money to Baylor University in the name of teaching. And so every 2 years, they basically hold a teaching competition. They collect nominations from the English-speaking world, and then they bring a few finalists. This is across all fields, and they have them spend a couple of days at Baylor guest teaching classes and giving a public lecture. And then they give very generous financial rewards, and then also have the ultimate winner come down to Waco to teach for a semester.
Yeah, and so you were selected, and something that I told my friends, yeah, Dr. Garg is definitely going to win this, and I'll tell you why. Because I had this class. It was OChem lecture lab, right? And I was in this class. It was at 12:30, and I actually had class on Tuesdays and Thursdays when that class was, and I just go straight from 8 to 4. I typically use that class view that you taught at as a lunch break. And so I'd actually have, and I was like bulking, and I was always like trying to eat like this full course meal while in the middle of class. So people would look over at me all the time, give me funny looks. But I was so preoccupied with eating that I didn't really focus on the lecture very much. And then you came, and I don't think I finished that whole meal because I was so like interested in what you were saying, and I knew that at that moment that this Dr. Garg is definitely winning it. So. Yeah, it's so nice to finally have you here, and I know a lot of people here are grateful for you, and they definitely kept you busy, huh?
Yeah, they kept me busy. Yeah, thanks for that, bringing back bad memories, man, from that competition. I'm kidding. It was, it was so much fun to be there, but obviously you prepare a lot for those classes. So I knew I had an hour and 15 minutes or something like that for your class to teach chemistry related to a lab. So I think I put in some video clips. Talked about probably phosphorescence, if I remember right.
Yeah.
I think I brought in glow sticks for the class.
Yep.
So yeah, that was pretty fun. So I'm sorry to keep you from bulking and enjoying your meal that day, but I had a good time. So
no, I could have kept off of it for a single meal, but I'm glad it worked out. So I thought a good place for us to start about your life is the fact that you actually co-authored a coloring book. Could you tell listeners a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. So first off, it's available on Amazon for $9.99 or something. I'm kidding. Don't feel obligated to buy it. But if anybody does want it, it is something that we self-publish. But the story behind it, I think, is the more interesting part, and I think the impact of it, I think, is maybe useful. But just to make a long story short, I was talking to my children. I'm the father of 4. And at the time, my 4-year-old asked me, with a little bit of a squint, maybe she raised her nostrils at me, asked her if the dinner I had served to her had chemicals in it, like with a look of disgust. And so of course me being a chemistry professor, I couldn't let that stand. Of course it has chemicals in it. And even when does a 4-year-old even pick up the idea that chemicals are bad? This blew my mind. So put her to work. First, actually, she showed her some common chemicals like sucrose and helped her understand why she likes dessert, amongst other things. And my kids both like to color. It turns out that they were interested in things like this. Where do chemicals come from? What are they? What are they made of? And so we kind of turned into a little bit of a game, and we decided just to make a coloring book, and we self-published it on Amazon. So I joke that it's available and people can buy it. And they can, but we did do that on purpose. That way people could buy it all over the world without publishing fees, that a typical publisher would have. But the other impact of it, I think, is kind of fun, is we basically do it for outreach. We give out thousands of copies of this book to students, to parents, to children. Whoever will take them, basically, will give them copies of this stuff for free. And it's meant to be a little bit of a chemistry outreach thing. Kids will color in anything. They may as well color in chemicals. But certainly we feel like maybe the ultimate impact is parents and young adults, students who read this and realize the impact that chemistry has, and that it's in fact all around them. Whereas I think the large part of the population may not necessarily appreciate that.
Yeah, so your daughter is elementary school, middle school now. And is she, like, after doing this, is she like wanting to be a chemist herself? I can't imagine, having my own, being a co-author on a book, and, especially on something that's, it's a kid's book, but at the same time, the content that it talks about is definitely something that even college students might not know about, right? So does she have any interest to be a chemist now, take after her father?
I'm not sure if yeah, that's Kaylee. So she's was the 4 now. Now she's 7.
Yeah.
And in 2nd grade, and her older sister is 11, just about to turn 12. I don't know if either of them would say that they're like dying to become a chemist or anything like that. I think it's a great example of childhood. In a sense, they helped create a coloring book, they co-authored it, and it's out there, but I don't know if they really realize, in my opinion, how cool it is for them to do it, and maybe later in life they will. But I think they carry themselves with some good amount of modesty about it.
No, I'm very jealous because I think that, whenever they go somewhere and as they grow up, that people are always going to ask them, tell me an interesting fact, what's one thing about you that no one knows about? And they can always bring up this coloring book, right? So it's a great go-to for them. So I'm glad to have that.
Yeah, my 11-year-old interviewed for a private school, and she was told she should bring in something interesting, and or a couple of things that were interesting, and of course she brought in the coloring book. She was admitted. She didn't end up accepting the admissions offer for that private school, but it was cool. She did use that exactly in the way you described.
Yeah. Let's talk about publishing for a minute, because this is something that a lot of I'm actually considering writing a book myself, and I'm genuinely interested in knowing a little bit about this process. So how does that what are the pros and cons versus self-publishing versus going through a publisher?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, first thing I'll say is self-publishing is super easy. And I never would have thought that, but it doesn't surprise me when I think about it, I think in hindsight, because technology is so good these days, it seems like you should be able to do that. But basically, there's a couple of different companies that offer self-publishing, and Amazon has an affiliate company. At the time, it was called CreateSpace. I think that's part of the Kindle publishing group now. But basically, they have an interface where you upload it to the specs that they request, right? So certain resolution of the documents and things like that. So they provide the specs, and you basically upload the materials, right? So you have to provide those in the right format and all that, but that's not hard to do. For certainly young people students like yourself could easily figure out how to do that. And so that's all you do, and you set the price that you want. And then you hit submit or whatever, and it shows up as an electronic instant proof, so you can proof it right away, or you can request a hard copy. So within a few days you get a hard copy, you can look through it, check it out, and whenever you feel it's good to go, you hit finalize, and it's on Amazon 20 minutes later. Wow.
I think that's something that a lot more authors are going to start taking advantage of, in my opinion, just because I think, why have a middleman when you can do it on your own, right? I thought a good place to go after this would be kind of your upbringing, and especially NYU, because I think that has a special place in your heart, it seems like. And as I was prepping for this episode, I saw that you were recently named a distinguished alumni for NYU for the year. So congrats on that.
Thank you, sir. Yeah.
And you're definitely like one of the youngest on that list. Does that surprise you, or is that something that you saw coming of any sort?
Certainly I think whenever you get an award, you look at the first thing you do is you should be in a little bit of shock, and then you look at the list of other recipients. I think what struck me about that list wasn't necessarily the age of the people. It was more that it was dominated by non-scientists. I don't know if there were any other scientists, or maybe very few on that list. Most of the people were certainly from NYU Film School, things like that. So you can see like Oliver Stone, Ang Lee. I don't know who else was on that list, but it was a pretty, almost comical list. Alec Baldwin was on that list. So that's what I noticed. There was a lot of very prominent actors, but I don't think, scientists or educators, that wasn't really there. So maybe I think NYU felt like that was an opportunity to expand their reach of what that distinguished alumni program was, and I was glad that felt very honored, and I thought that was a very cool thing. But yeah, I didn't quite realize the ages, the age discrepancies. And admittedly, I didn't look up everybody, and I didn't know if I knew who everybody was. Yeah. But there were definitely some common household names, which I think provided a lot of entertainment for my students back at UCLA.
Yeah. And I think, naturally, just the way the podcast is done, I naturally look at age, right? It's such just something I came across, and that stood out to me. But, I'm really interested in hearing about, why NYU, like, how did you even come to NYU? And, being an Indian kid, I'm sure that, you have some expectations from parents going into college. And I'm just really interested in hearing how you ended up navigating to NYU and how you ended up becoming a chemist during that time.
Sure. So the real story is actually a little ridiculous. I think that, at the time, I don't know if I had any desire to stay too close to home, and I grew up in a little town called Fishkill, New York. Geographically, not too far from New York City, maybe like 90 miles, but I didn't really spend all that much time in New York City growing up. And generally, when I was looking at colleges, I was looking at places that were a little further away. And I had a good friend who, he and I wanted to go see a concert at Madison Square Garden. It's this band REM. The young people may or may not know REM, but they were a great band, and they were playing at Madison Square Garden, and we wanted to go, and so we got tickets. And from where we lived, we could take the train down there. We were old enough that our parents were cool with letting this happen, and he really wanted to check out NYU. So I was like, all right, cool, let's make a day of it. So we went down in the morning, and we checked out the campus. We did the tour, all that stuff, and it was just a place with a lot of energy. And so not a place I knew anything about otherwise, but somehow it kind of surprised me. And the fact that there's not really a defined campus at NYU. It's literally just built into New York City. A lot of the buildings are clustered around Washington Square Park, but there's certainly no defined campus. And it's like if you go to college there, your campus is New York City. And I just thought it'd be a fun place, so I decided to apply. And thankfully, they gave me some scholarship money that I think was really important at the time for being able to afford to go there. So for me, things worked out. I had a couple of other choices that were all great choices, but for some reason I just felt like I fit in well, not just at NYU, but as being part of New York City. I just thought I fit in there.
And so when did this realization that you wanted to be a chemist come about?
Yeah, so when I went to NYU, it was pretty clearly set upon me. The expectation from the parentals is that I would be a pre-med.
Sure.
And I had an older brother who was in medical school, and so they that was just sort of the expectation. Actually, a lot of my friends were doing that. It seemed pretty common that people who came out doing well from my high school went down the pre-med track. So I had a great group of really close friends, and for example, there were 7 of us. We did everything together. All of us were pre-med. I don't think any of us actually fulfilled that prophecy.
Oh, that's very interesting. So you think at least a few of them, would go through with it, right? But that's really interesting. So where did they all end up?
A couple of them became engineers, electrical engineer, two became chemical engineers. Different things. Finance, business and finance.
Yeah.
One initially went to law school and then now operates hedge funds.
Sure.
So a lot of different variety. They're all just wickedly smart people, so it doesn't surprise me that they all went in different directions. But I think it was just a little bit of our upbringings, a little bit of like, hey, I'm going to be a doctor. Okay, we'll all be doctors. But to ultimately answer your question, I took chemistry classes because I was a pre-med. I didn't really have a lot of choice in that, right? You take chemistry, physics, and biology. The biology just didn't really excite me. I felt like it was a lot of memorization the way it was taught. And in the meantime, I was good at chemistry, and over time I got more interested in it. And especially by the time I took organic chemistry, I had a lot of opportunities to get involved in research. I had opportunities to be a teaching assistant being in my second year. So I did a lot of research and a lot of teaching, and I liked chemistry and I was good at it. So over time, it seemed to me that was a better fit than going to medical school. And then you see what older students are doing. Older students are freaking out because they're studying for the MCAT. And then I had friends in my research lab that were going to grad school a year or two older. They would be applying to places like Berkeley and Princeton. Two really great friends of mine went to those two schools. And the application process is very different. The GRE process versus the MCAT, the level of stress there, very different.
Sure.
They weren't studying. They were just winging these tests. No stress. They do great. They would get into these schools. They would be recruited to those schools, and they would not have to, they may pay an application fee, but once you got admitted, they would recruit you, right? You'd go to visit there. They would expense it all, and they'd show you a great time, and they'd say, we want you to come to Berkeley or whatever it was. It was very different from the people that seemed like they were getting hazed in the medical school process.
It's a funny way to describe it, but a little bit of fact in that. Yeah.
It's just how my impression at the time.
Sure.
It's just like, wow, you got to apply, and at all time you're on edge.
Yeah.
Go to get an interview, you might get waitlisted. It'll burn you for a couple more months. All that intensity plus that that focus on the MCAT, and then on top of all that, the money wasn't really an issue, but it certainly was attractive that if you go to graduate school, you are paid a stipend and all your tuition is covered. So you're effectively paid to go get a degree. And if you really like that, teaching and doing research, it's like, wow, I can go get paid to do teaching and research. This is awesome, right?
Why would I go doing it? You're already doing it, all this in undergrad, right? At the time.
That's right. And so why would I not do that, first of all? And then if I really didn't enjoy biology or that sort of thing, or I didn't really see the benefits of medical school, I mean, it was pretty easy, I think. I think the harder part was communicating this to my parents and navigating that conversation. But I think eventually, they came around.
What did you tell them?
And it was rough, right? I mean, I basically told them that I wanted to go to chemistry graduate school, and they knew I was I was teaching and I was doing research. So I don't know if they were surprised, but they still thought I should, consider medical school instead. They definitely tried to convince me to keep my options open, even after a long time when I knew, and tried to communicate that. They signed me up for MCAT classes anyway. That's
funny. I mean, when did you have this conversation with them? Like, how old were you at the time? Or you're in college?
Let's see. Yeah, maybe like my probably between my second and third year, or early in my third year, was probably when I would have had a better sense that that's what I wanted to do. Certainly after I completed organic chemistry, I think was more when I was like enjoying chemistry and I taught at that point. So I'm guessing toward the beginning of my junior year, but I don't know if I remember.
Right.
Yeah, but eventually my dad just signed me up for MCAT classes, and I think that took a couple of conversations because that's really expensive.
Right.
And I didn't want to go.
Yeah.
And so I had to eventually just tell him that I wasn't going to go. And he's better off keeping his money because I'm just not going to go to the class. So, not the smoothest of all conversations. I don't remember the details, but yeah, certainly not a smooth conversation. But it had to be done, right? If I didn't really have my heart in that, it's a challenging thing. Your parents want the best for you, and that's their goal. They think the best thing for you is to go to medical school. Navigating that as you figure out what you want to do isn't the easiest thing.
Sure. Yeah. And one of the things that you also talk about, or you talked to me about in the past about your time at NYU, is that you served as an RA.
Yeah.
And that's something that not only have you done that when you were in college, but even as a professor at UCLA, you continue to live with students as a faculty in residence. Could you talk to us a little bit about that experience and why it means so much to you?
Yeah, where to begin, and I'll try to be concise here, but it's funny, I think a lot of my time has been, I think a lot of the things I've done are just based on opportunities that come up, not necessarily, this master plan of how things will evolve, but it's this really random, but at some point in my dorm, in my freshman or sophomore year, maybe it was my freshman year actually, there was a sign in the mailroom over the winter break from somebody who runs, I don't know what office she was in. Her name is Dorothy Booker, and she lived on the top floor of the dorm. She's sort of like an executive staff member maybe, and she needed somebody to catalog her record collection. Well, it's totally bizarre, right? So I called the number, I did that, she hired me. There was another person living on the top floor. I tutored their kids. I just bizarre opportunities. And then she got me a job in the budgeting office at NYU, and then they connected me to an open job in the summer housing office. So that's ultimately how I got involved in dorm type activities, is because I saw this random ad to catalog somebody's record collection, and I knew how to use Excel, so I did all this. But because I did well in that opened up more opportunities for me. Once I was in the housing community, then you get to know people, and you learn about the RA program and what it takes to get those positions. And I thought it would be attractive to do it for the housing benefit, of course, right? You get an apartment, you get a meal plan. And then as I went through the interview process, I thought it was pretty interesting. This is a time in New York City when, NYU just in general, a place that is a champion for diversity, right? They really care about this. So you're learning a lot about that during the time. But that era was also around the age of Rent, the Broadway show, a lot around HIV. It was just an interesting time for diversity. And so I thought it was pretty intriguing. I applied and I got the job, and it was fun. All of a sudden you have a group. I was in a dorm of like 30 RAs, a 32-story skyscraper in New York City. We had a ton of RAs, and this became my closest group of friends. And so you do activities, you do your thing with your residents, you plan activities, you help with conflict resolution, and they give you all this training along the way. But I think those types of things like an appreciation for diversity and how to handle conflict, or really special things that one is learning during that. And I think I probably appreciated it to some minimal level at the time. Went to grad school and all that, and then many years later at UCLA, they have this program called Faculty in Residence, where faculty live in the dorms, and they also interact then with all the RAs and things like that. And watching that and being part of it, kind of watching it from the outside, it is amazing to watch the students learning those skills, understanding diversity, understanding conflict resolution, through the exact same type of experiences that I went through, but I can kind of watch it from the outside. And when I do that, I realize how much it affects me and my ability to be a good teacher, a good mentor, a good advisor, just a good person in general. So I always try to chime into those students on the UCLA RA staff, make sure that they reflect a little bit on some of the things that they're doing and remind them that, in my opinion, they are learning a lot of skills, whether they realize it or not, that will benefit them for the rest of their lives. And so I really appreciate it, in hindsight.
Yeah, so you mentioned a couple of things there that hopefully I can tap into a little bit deeper. So you said conflict resolution. So what does that look like to you, as a faculty in residence? What did it look like to you when you were an RA? And what are some things that you've learned about conflict resolution going through all these experiences?
But number one is probably that there's two sides to every story. That's always an important one. So, I'm trying to remember a case where a couple of people came to me and they were really upset with their roommate. And to me, I listened to it all. It was heartbreaking, and I just assumed whatever they said was valid. And it was on a weekend. I pulled the panic trigger. It wasn't that wild, but to me, it was the way they described it. And so I tried to get in touch with the building manager. The building manager on the weekend stopped personal plans to go through it with me. And then they're like, "Have you talked to the other person?" And it was very clear, And
you're just like, "Oh,
no,
crap! No,
I should have obviously talked to the other person involved." And once I did that, I got a totally different side of the story, right? And then having to navigate that meeting with all of them, and getting some help from the person who was running the building. I forgot what they called it, but basically the resident director. I think I learned a lot from that particular process, that never just jump to one conclusion based on one side of the story. Make sure you have a conversation with the other side of the story that's not accusatory or attacking. Try to understand it and deal with the conflict. So that would be certainly one easy thing that I think, any young person, if you hear anything that sounds negative, just step back, take a step back, and make sure you understand all perspectives before you proceed forward. Your job isn't to take sides, it's to help the conflict, and you got to understand the conflict before you can do anything to resolve it.
Yeah, and one interesting thing that I was thinking about as you were telling that story is that when you went to the office manager, you were so emotionally invested in this story, right? And sometimes in times of conflict, we let our emotions dictate the decisions that we make. And even just taking that minute to pause and reflecting on that can be huge, because then you might have picked up that, oh, I forgot to ask the other person. Let me go seek that side from that perspective first before I go to the office manager. So just something that came to my mind.
Definitely. And, another, I think, somewhat related idea, and this is something that they will talk about at UCLA. I've heard it talked about at some of these meetings with the student staff. I can't remember where I first heard it, but somebody said, let's take a step back, and I want to encourage everybody to always assume positive intent. And that means that when you hear something that gets you a little riled up, you just stop and you wait a second, what's the positive angle to explain that? Because our tendency sometimes is to take things personally. And if you just take a step back and be like, wait a second, maybe they meant this, maybe they meant that, it at least takes the edge off, if nothing else, and it allows you to have, I think, a more open conversation about whatever the conflict is. But if one just assumes like, oh yeah, whatever I heard is right, it's not good. But if you take a step back and you're like, well, let's assume that person didn't mean to do that.
Yeah.
What would that conversation look like? And it just changes one's mindset. And so I play this game a lot with, not game, I should say, but basically I have that conversation with many people now. When people, it doesn't matter what it is, professional or social conversation, if somebody is a little tense about something, that's the first thing I'll say is, like, hey, let's assume positive intent. What if the person didn't mean that? Are there scenarios to explain it? And if there are reasonable scenarios to explain it, if nothing else, it takes the edge off and it allows one to have a more open conversation.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then the second thing that you mentioned when you were explaining the story was your experience as being an RA is you talked about diversity. And I've heard you talk about that even with the TEDx talk that you give out that we'll talk about in a little bit. But what did you learn about diversity that you think that isn't something that everyone hears about, or when they hear diversity that what you think of that other people don't?
Well, I think that at NYU, I grew up in a certain town, it was Fishkill, New York, and I'd say people were homophobic, right? That might be a reasonable thing to say about my school, like no doubt. And then you go to NYU and it's really very different. There are many, many openly homosexual people. It was during the time of things like Rent, the Tom Hanks movie Philadelphia. You know what I mean? Like these were things that were part of the culture, and in a place like New York City, that sort of diversity was much more, people were open about it. I'll remember another one where I was trying to put on a certain dorm activity where it was like, decorate my Christmas tree and watch a Christmas movie. And they, at least the resident director said, that's fine, you can do that, but have you thought about if this is inclusive to other people that don't celebrate Christmas? How do you think about that?
And that thought probably didn't even come across your mind at the time, huh?
And I see this all the time, even with my graduate students. They'll talk about, hey, can we have a Christmas party? I'm like, no, we can have a holiday party. But we won't have a specific Christmas party. You guys come to my house, and if I have a Christmas tree, that's fine. People can do whatever they want, but nobody should be celebrating anything that I think is, with more of a religious affiliation. Everybody doesn't celebrate Christmas. And so I think that would be an example of something I picked up from trying to plan a dorm event. And now many years later, when I run my research lab, even if somebody says, are we going to have a Christmas party, I will correct them and say that we will have a party, absolutely, but it's a holiday party, and here's why, and make sure that people are tuned into that.
Gotcha. One other thing that really stands out to you probably from your time at NYU is that you met your wife there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm a sucker for how couples meet, and so I just was wondering how did that happen?
Yeah, let's see. First I'll say my wife doesn't remember it, so that's not a good start. But that's okay. It worked out fine. But yeah, I got involved in these dorm activities, and one of the incentives that NYU will offer is if you want to move in early to the dorms, there's opportunities for you to do that if you are willing to help people move in and coordinate different activities. So I did this, and they had us put to work, and I coordinated an ice cream social. And one of the people I did this with turned out to be her roommate. And so basically that's how I met my wife, was through the process of coordinating this ice cream social and going back and forth to this other girl's room to deal with ice cream and coolers or whatever else we were juggling around. That's ultimately how I met my wife. I then had a job at working at the front desk in the dorm building, and so then I would see her a lot and we would talk and things like that. It then also turned out that I had a roommate who was a film major, and my wife was a film major, same year. And then she had a roommate that was taking the same chemistry classes that I was taking. And so we had another point of common connection between our roommates, kind of randomly. So we ended up just, that's how we met. We didn't date for several years, but we certainly knew each other and spent a lot of time together.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Like I said, I just love hearing about how people meet. So I should also note that, when we keep talking about dorm life, and I want to make this distinction because at some schools dorm life is something you just live at your freshman year and then you're done, but and then you live off campus maybe. But at NYU and other schools that are located in the city, like typically dorms are what students live at all 4 years, right? Anyway, I just wanted to make that clear as you're talking about the story, because it's not like you just stuck around. It's actually like where everyone stuck around too, right?
That's right. I mean, NYU being in New York City at the time, I assume it's still the same. They guarantee you housing for 4 years because it's in New York City, and they have to do it. So they guarantee that unless you move out of the dormitory system, you can stay there. But it was interesting because they kept on taking more students, and they ran out of they basically started running out of housing. So they would lease buildings. So that 32-story skyscraper I was in, that was the Prudential security building. Wow. And so NYU leased it, and they renovated it and turned it into a dorm. Nowadays, it's 200 Water Street for anybody who goes down there. Nowadays, that's a luxury apartment building.
Huh.
This beautiful skyscraper in New York City. You actually can see it on lots of photos of the Brooklyn Bridge. It's one of the really beautiful buildings in the background. Anyway, just a random fun fact.
That's really neat.
But that's right though. But most students are there for 4 years.
Yeah. So I thought we could transition to talk about your TEDx video, which I was really intrigued at after watching. It's called Challenge Your Perceptions, and I'll include a link in the show notes for listeners. Y'all should definitely watch it if you get a chance. Before we talk about this video, when people ask me, what does success look like, or when do you know you made it? I always joke around that it's when I have a TED Talk. So to me, you definitely, Dr. Garg, you made it. There's a lot of bits and pieces from that episode that can be applied to a lot of different things and parts of life. And so I was hoping to dissect into that a little bit. So maybe you could just kind of introduce this concept. How did you come across this perspective, and what is kind of, challenging your perceptions? What does that look like? What is that?
Right. So yeah, where to begin here. So basically, I got invited to give a TEDx talk at UCLA. The first thing I'll say is that in some ways it is a great thing where you're like, wow, this is awesome. In other ways, it is terrifying, and no doubt it's one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life is just preparing for that. So, if you're looking forward to that as your sign of success, maybe dial it down and don't look forward to it too much. It's actually really it was a very hard thing to do. And I'm really glad it's over. And
is that because the way the TED conference is done, they have like a certain format, and I notice that people, whenever they talk, they have, they say things in a similar way, and it almost feels like, that they've practiced a ton of times, but what goes into that? What makes it so challenging?
Well, I think what makes it challenging is you're trying to, one, talk to a general audience, when most of the time when I'm talking to people, it's talking chemistry.
Sure.
And chemists have research slides with lots of chemical structures. So usually you're pointing at chemical structures, things like that. So depends on your style. I try to talk to the audience, but still in large portion for scientific lectures, people might be pointing at slides, things like that. For a TEDx talk, you're just staring down an audience of 600 people. You're never looking at your slides, right? You're 100% always looking forward. So just stylistically, that's very different. And to just be standing in front of 600 people talking about whatever you're talking about, it's just an intimidating thing. The other thing that I thought that the TEDx conference did really beautifully is they had coaching. So they had, the people that run the TED conference, and they had an actor, Greg Gurman, come to these sessions, and he would email me. He's like a busy guy off on film shoots and whatnot. In the meantime, he's reading my script and helping me edit it. But what they really were focused on is what's the idea, and what are ideas that you can talk about that transcend, right? The talk shouldn't be about organic chemistry, right? There are some things there that you can talk about, but how do you really, what is that message that you want to convey? And so picture you're putting this together, you're a parent, you're a husband, you're teaching a 400-person class, and at the time I was also doing the equivalent of a GoFundMe type thing, or it's called UCLA Spark, but basically a fundraiser. So I had a lot going on at the time, and so in the meantime, trying to prepare a talk and think about what do you really want to say? What's the idea that you want to share? That's the type of stuff that makes it really hard, to be thinking about that. And I think that's not the way most people like me are thinking at all times. And so in that way, I'll say it was really hard, but what a great and rewarding experience to do that. For all the things that are great challenges typically end up being things that have a big payoff, right? And I think for me, it's just with the stuff I learned and having the time to think, making the time to think like that.
And so, how did you come across this, challenger perception, perspective?
Sure. So, I think ultimately, I think what that has to do with is just the fact that organic chemistry has been, detested or hated, had a bad reputation for a really long time, and with what I try to do with teaching is trying to flip that so that students leave thinking that organic chemistry is the best class that they've taken in their 4 years in college. That's my goal.
Right. That's a very bold goal, but yeah, it seems like you've also had a lot of success with it too, right?
So that's the goal, and that was, I think, the spirit of the talk. And so a lot of people come in with that, some preconceived notion or a preconception or perception, whatever it is, like some subtle differences there, but for all practical purposes, pretty similar. And that those are things that can be overturned. I was told that organic chemistry was going to be awful, but that's now my career path and, in many ways a hobby for me. I really enjoy it. So I think that's where that message came from. It's not to, not to believe the type of thing that you hear and what one should be challenging, whatever those preconceptions are.
Yeah, so now as we think about, taking that perspective and applying it to everyday life, you talk about, you could do this politics, with your views on diversity, almost anything you can think of, you can, take this perspective and use it in other things. How does that look like for you?
Sure. So, basically, one should always be, I think, questioning anything we hear. Politics right now, what a interesting and unusual time for politics. And you will hear every spectrum of the conversation these days. And I think I try my best when I hear those things just to listen and try to learn and understand the issues. And I really try to avoid the getting stuck in the middle of political conversations these days. But I think encouraging understanding. I think my wife is very good at this, always trying to understand what other people think and what the facts are, and also understanding other people's perspectives before trying to jump in with a firm opinion on the way things should be. I think a lot of these things are just far more complicated, and just making sure that we don't just jump to our whatever it is that our first thought is, or our preconceptions about things. Take time to understand it, and I think it's just a valuable perspective, a valuable way for us to live.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and it kind of goes back to the topic the conversation we were having earlier about conflict resolution, and how just you hear something that challenges what you originally think, and you're emotionally invested in this, and you have this feeling of maybe it's not anger, but it's definitely you feel some discomfort, right? And this weekend I was actually at a conference where I got to hear from Arthur Brooks, who's the president of AEI and American Enterprise Institute, and then John Powell, who is a very well-known activist but professor at UC Berkeley. And one of the things they were talking about is, whenever you have this disapproval, it's really important that you take a second just to pause and just to understand that frustration or that discomfort that you might have. And I thought, wow, that's such simple advice, but it goes such a long way. And it seems like that's kind of a similar point that you're making as well. So whenever students do face a challenge, what are some mistakes that you think they make?
Well, I think the first assumption is that a challenge is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And I think right there, that's the mistake. I think any challenge, one should take a deep breath and absorb and understand, but most challenges can turn into really great opportunities. That's ultimately what I view. So I think in my case, organic chemistry was challenging. Once I figured it out, it just opened up doors for me. And it still is today, 20 plus years since I took organic chemistry classes. That challenge, I think, creates opportunity. So that's number one. I think first and foremost, I think if we're challenging students in the classroom, that is a good thing for them. No matter how you look at it, it can open doors. And I think that should be our goal in academia and education places like where we are here at Baylor. It should be to challenge students, take them out of their comfort zone, teach them some lessons that will transcend the subject so that they can excel in their other classes and everything else they do.
Yeah, and just to push on that a little bit, I think students sometimes find themselves taking classes that are hard, but it becomes worse when it's a class that you really don't want to take, or you're just taking it just to take it, or it's a requirement. But at the same time, I think people or young adults in general, they might be in a job where they're doing a task that they really don't want to do, right? Mm-hmm. And on top of that, it's hard and it's challenging. When you have that kind of perspective, how do you challenge that and make this something more fun?
So organic chemistry, if students are coming into my class, chances are when they're coming in, most of them are not excited to be there. Most of them are not going to go and pursue organic chemistry as a career path. Maybe some of them will be converted, if you will. Maybe a few of them really like it. But it's typically not the case. And so I think the first problem is that academics need to understand that we're not necessarily teaching everybody to become organic chemists. We're teaching them because there should be some learning outcomes that transcend organic chemistry that are far more important than any specific chemical reaction that we're teaching. So I think part of the problem is, I hate to throw my colleagues under the bus and maybe myself as well, but part of the problem is just academia. We need to better understand students, period, and remember that their goal isn't necessarily, our goal for teaching them should be in line with what they want to get out of their time in the classroom. So that's probably number one. I think then otherwise it's also the burden is on the faculty member, the teacher, to make sure the class is engaging. And then if a student really isn't engaged in it, I would suggest a couple of things, and it would certainly be to study with other people. That's a good way to find the motivation, because if you're not really into something, you're going to have a hard time devoting the time to study for it. If you're a social person and you like studying with other people, then I usually would say, hey, take the time to set up a study group, and then that can be fun because you can interact with your friends and whatnot, but then hopefully you also get some studying done. By connecting at that level where you might be learning the material but also doing it in a social environment, I think for a lot of people that could have big benefits if you're not otherwise engaged, because maybe once you start learning more and you're getting help from each other and it's in a social environment, I think it'd just be very powerful. So that might be some of the things I would say just to get started. Sometimes it's also if things are just really confusing, to go to office hours, get to know the professor, realize they're not there to try to destroy you. And then sometimes there are things that you just don't connect with.
Sure.
And that's just how it is. And but that doesn't mean that one should still try to make an effort to get everything they can out of the class in the process of just letting it pass. But sometimes that's bound to happen. I'm sure I took some classes in college where I just wasn't interested, but I still did whatever it took to do well enough to get the grade and just force myself to learn what I could and get a respectable grade that I was comfortable with. And such is life,
Yeah.
There are always things that aren't quite exactly what you want to spend your time doing, but you do them for different reasons.
Right. And I guess, the big perspective that you've always shared on the TED Talk, and even just from hearing you, is try to find a way to make it fun or meaningful, try to connect it to real life ideas or like the why of why you're doing it in the first place. Just something that's bigger than just the task itself, right? That can make it a little bit more fun. So,
there I do think the burden is on the professors, not on the students, right? But over time, if you're a student, how do you draw that out from a professor? I don't know. I will say the one thing that professors, uniformly don't like is students begging for points on things.
Sure.
If something's unreasonable, do it. But I think that it's interesting. I think students that really learn and understand, that inspires professors to want to do it more. When students do the opposite, where they're asking questions that don't reflect that they actually have a desire to learn. Do I need to know that for the test? Do I need to know that for the test? They're reasonable questions, right? People are curious about things, but there might be a way to ask it that doesn't make the professor think, man, all this person cares about is the grade.
Right.
You know what I mean? So if, for any students that are listening to this podcast, think about even how you phrase questions. It's reasonable for you to ask something if you're responsible to know something. If it's all phrased in the context of a test, it might make it seem like you don't really care. And so that can actually, I think, have a negative impact on how much the professor enjoys the teaching experience, which then affects you in a negative way as a student. So those moments where students are really asking because they're curious about things and they're understanding things and they're studying, that I think can make a professor more excited about teaching.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to think about what might be some useful advice for students or some perspective that would help students. But ultimately, I do think a lot of the burden for making a class engaging, making sure students understand why they're taking it, why it's relevant, that should fall on the professor.
Sure.
To make an effort to do it. But over time, I think hopefully more faculty will do that.
Yeah.
And plenty do, obviously, right? Plenty really do prioritize those types of things.
Yeah. One of the things that you, I'm sure you get asked about all the time is life advice. You see college kids that are, juniors, seniors that come to you. What advice do you have as, students or young adults that are quote unquote adulting, right? What do you typically tell students?
Yeah, let's see. All sorts of advice I can give people. And like all advice, it should be taken or ignored. Feel free to disregard. But I think the two things are, one is to make sure you enjoy your time in college. Sounds counterintuitive for something that, as something that somebody like me would say. But certainly things only get busier for most people after college. Whether it be for professional reasons, in my case, going to graduate school, very, very intense time for 5 years, right? And it doesn't stop when you're a postdoc and then you get a job as a new professor at a place like UCLA. The intensity has only gone up. And then alongside of that, a lot of people post-college, their personal time, their relationships and things like that evolve. They may have family members that are getting older. They may have a spouse, things. They may have children, right? So overall, I felt like for me, the extent of responsibility has just only gone up dramatically. So sometimes I hear students taking on a lot of activities in their senior year and things like that. And I'd always caution, make the most of your senior year in whatever way makes sense to you. But don't feel like you need to accomplish everything for the next 80 years of your life in your senior year. you got a lot of time to do things, and making sure you enjoy it, maintain your friendships and things like that. I think that's really valuable. The other thing is, I don't think it's impossible for students to balance their time in a way that's 100% academic so they can't have a social life. And vice versa, there are certainly those students that party hard or do whatever they're doing and they don't study. And I think for me, it took me probably like 2 years or so in college to figure out that I could have a really great social life and I could study and do really well academically. It took me about 2 years to figure that out. Just getting good study habits where it's like between classes, I would go to the library. I wouldn't go back to the dorm. As soon as I went back to the dorm, I had a great time. It was fun, but I didn't get any studying done. So I learned how to study regularly during the day. Then when I went back to the dorm in the evening, I had a blast with my friends. So I think that's the other lesson I'd say for people in the college experience is to, not just enjoy your time, but use it as a way to perfect those, that sort of the balancing act that we all face. Use college as a way to do that. And I think most students, when they figure out how to do this, it's very powerful. It's very, it builds your confidence. Right? Wow, I could juggle a couple of different things. I could do it smoothly. And I get good grades, and I can have a great social life. I think it's all within reason. And I think as you go forward, you only get busier. So that time in college to learn how to do that and push yourself to do it, I think is really valuable. And it will help one's success well after college if one can learn how to juggle and excel in a couple of different areas. Everybody suffers from work-life balance challenges. I don't know anybody that doesn't. Some people can make it look easy, but it doesn't mean it's not hard or challenging. And so that's probably what I'd say is prepare for that. Sure. if one can. And I think college is a good time to do it because it always seems like things are crazy, but I can say for myself, and I certainly say for many people I know, that it only gets crazier.
It only gets worse.
It only gets, yeah. I mean, crazier, it doesn't necessarily mean bad.
Yeah.
Right? It certainly just becomes more complicated.
Right. I'm even looking at my own life where, I'm about to go to med school next year. And in my mind, I'm going, well, in college, I have to balance like 6 different things. You have school and then, maybe like a podcast and some other things that I'm involved with. But, I think of med school and I think, all I have to do is study and, maybe like do one other thing that I'm really passionate about and maybe do a podcast, keep this up, and I'll be good. I'll be golden. But in reality, you forget that that's a lot more than what you imagine it to be. So yeah, I think that's a conundrum that people always find themselves in. Now, when you were in your 20s, is there perspectives that changed as you transitioned into your 30s when it comes to just like adulting, quote unquote?
Well, first of all, 30 is the new 20, I think, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, things have just been so busy. Things just get more and more complicated. I think going from that sort of like that time in my life, I think would be characterized by being a relative, just starting as a professor, right? That'd be around what I was doing at that time, and becoming a parent. That's what I would have been doing at that age 10 years ago, right? Yeah, so that makes sense. I was, had a young one, probably 2 or 3 years old at the time. So, I mean, I think your perspective changes is just because you're used to one thing I'd say is that you're used to prioritizing yourself. I think at a certain point in college, I think just in general, like you have time for that. But if you have a family, if you're responsible for a lot of students, whether it be teaching a 400-person class or running a research lab of 20 people, you now have some responsibilities that affect a lot of other people. And so your actions and your decisions have to be dealt with really carefully. I think that's probably the most important thing. The other one, I think I used to get really good at getting a lot done. I got really efficient. And somewhere around when I turned 30, I realized that I couldn't get everything done that was on my list. I'm a list guy. I get my list together, pretty organized. What do I need to get done? How am I going to get it done? I used to be able to do most of it, come up with a realistic list. And I realized that I couldn't do it. I just couldn't get everything done. And coming to terms with that being normal, I think is okay, because I think like, some people can feel bogged down by that, right? Oh, I didn't get anything done. Well, no, you did, right? It's just that sometimes you get pulled in different directions and you can't achieve all the things you want to do in a day. So that's probably, I think around the time I was 30, I think that was something that I remember affecting me, being like, wait a second, I used to be able to do everything and I can't do it anymore. There's a joke about this because at the time I had a birthday coming up and I was at a faculty dinner, and it was at a really nice Chinese restaurant in like Beverly Hills, something ridiculous. And they gave us fortune cookies at the end. And earlier in that evening, one of the professors was talking about how she bought a new Porsche Boxster, and she had the old one, and she had to sell it. And so people were like, Neil, you got to buy this car. And I'm like, ha, 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 right? So I opened the fortune cookie, right? And again, this is around this time where I'm realizing I can't do everything. And I opened the fortune cookie and it says, treat yourself to something nice. You deserve it. And I'm like, wow, I'm going to get this car, like I have been working really hard and worried about, being able to juggle things. So ultimately, I'll say that realization helped me actually purchase this totally ridiculous car.
So you got the Porsche.
It was a little bumpy, but we made it work. I think I called my wife, or I told her when I got home, and she was like, no. And then the next day, I got a flat tire on the way to work in my little Nissan Sentra.
Oh no!
And I called her, and I was like, "It's a sign." She's like, "Do you really believe in that?" And I said, "Come on, let's go for a test drive." And so anyway, because they were friends, we got the friends and family discount,
sure,
if you will. So it was a very attractive purchase at the time, and it was a 2-seater. And the rule or the agreement, which I offered, was that as soon as we are expecting another kid, I'll sell the car. So I had a good time with this car for 2 or 3 years, and then I paid a lot of bills for it because I've now learned the lesson that cars like that are ridiculously expensive to maintain, unfortunately. But it was fun, and I sold it, and it was good while it lasted. But anyway, I associate that story with that 20 to 30 transition,
sure,
very much, because it was definitely this time where I was like, I can't achieve everything I feel like I need to achieve. I just couldn't keep up on things. So I'll go buy a sports car, and so my students thought this was hilarious.
I love that. It's a post-quarter crisis.
Yeah, somebody called it a midlife crisis, and my wife's like, let's not call it that anymore. That's a little,
too young for that.
You're just turning 30,
yeah. So Dr. Garg, you've been able to do so much within, the past 20 years that has really set you apart from a lot of your peers. When you reflect on that yourself, what do you think has led to your success?
I think really simply, if I enjoy something and I want to spend my time on it, I'll find a way to do it. That's really what it comes down to. So I think figuring out what you enjoy and not spending time doing things you don't enjoy is probably the advice I would pass along to students as best as one can. There's some things that we have to do, but I think when things are don't agree to do things that one isn't really excited about, and if you are excited about it, I usually will just take the plunge to somehow initiate things to make them happen. I think I've always done it, but I think the point where I realized how important it was is I heard somebody talk about, this is a MIT professor, talking about how edX was created and how they knew that they wanted to have this educational system where you can take MIT courses from anywhere around the world. They had this meeting about it. They knew they wanted to do it. And he said something to the effect of they just set a date for when it was going to be released, and they publicized it, and they had nothing at that point except for an idea for what they wanted to do. And he was laughing when he was describing this. He's like, we knew that if we didn't just set a date, we were all so busy it just wasn't going to happen. So that's generally what I'll do. It's like if I feel like I really want to do something, I'll set things in motion to get them started. Right, for sure. And I think that's the way to do it, is I can keep something on my list to do, it'll just keep going to the bottom. But if I just once I initiate activities and get other people involved in those activities, typically then the energy and the momentum builds, and one can follow through a lot more easily when there's other people involved too. So certainly any of the educational initiatives that I've done, I think, come with other people being involved, but I think it's always about starting the process, putting the wheels in motion, so that things actually happen. But that's what it comes down to. I think there's so much to do. How do you juggle it all? I think I just like to set the wheels in motion, and I get to get teams together and get people excited.
You've probably had some of the most success that a chemist at your age has had. I don't want to put you on the spot with this, but I'm just going to ask the question. Is Nobel something you ever think of? No.
No, I think my dad does.
Yeah. And
every time I just laugh at him. Yeah.
Why is that?
It's not really like that. It's like, I don't know. I think one shouldn't, I don't think it's great to obsess over things like that. And generally, I think so many things would have to align for something like that to happen. And, I think that the research should have an impact on the world. And I think it's tough to do that predictively, and one shouldn't be aiming for that. You know what I mean? I think we pursue problems for research that we enjoy doing that are also good educational opportunities for the graduate students who are working on those. So that's usually my highest priority. I think for most academics, I think that the what we, our biggest product, if you will. In some cases, maybe there's a research contribution that turns out to be really revolutionary. I think we do plenty of cool things, and I think the group has done well for those. But at the same time, maybe the students that are coming out of my research lab are the biggest sign of the success of the lab. So I think for me, that's what I'm most proud of. I think I'd never necessarily shoot for a research award of that magnitude. For sure. I think that the stars have to align for things like that to come together.
Sure.
So I'm in awe of anybody who gets a Nobel Prize. I think that's awesome, but
so you're more focused on the process and what you're doing in the present. And
I love doing. Actually, I'm really focused on the research too. I spend inordinate amounts of time on that, at every level. But I think it's having some recognition that for most people in academia, when one goes to retire, what is what's left behind from all the time, effort, and resources that went into your time as a researcher. At this point, I have 22 students who have gotten PhDs with me, and there'll be many more of them, many other people that worked with me in different respects. This is a really, really awesome thing, and it's unclear to me that it's tough to predict a moment where it's going to be that my research overshadows that.
Sure.
We do, I think, really amazing things. We publish in very top-notch journals. We have a lot of grant money to do these things, and we are developing things that people, especially in industry, actually use to try to discover new drugs. So we're very proud of those things. We keep doing them. We work in Alzheimer's research. We have lots of these directions, but it's hard to really do something that. It's not that we're not shooting to do it, but I think realistically, it's almost like a needle in a haystack. To do something that has an impact globally that affects humanity from a research discovery. It's just statistically not the most obvious thing that I see coming out of it. So I don't really think about things like the Nobel Prize.
Gotcha.
It'd be stranger things have happened, right? People get things like that, and I've certainly gotten a lot of awards, but Nobel.
Just not something that. Well, if it does happen, it is something that I root for. I joke around with my friends, Dr. Garg's going to win it one day, and then
you should hang out with my dad. My dad will be right there with you.
No, well, we're definitely on that. We're definitely rooting for you. Dr. Garg, it's been such a pleasure tapping into you about all these random things. Do you have any parting words for the listeners?
No, I'd just say, this has been fun to do, Yash. Thanks for having me. I'd say to any young listeners, if there's something that from this podcast that resonated with you, or if you're passing through Waco or Los Angeles, give me a call. And I just wish you luck in all the things you're doing. And it's been a lot of fun, Yash. Thanks again.
Yeah. And then where can listeners reach you? Any social media or?
Yeah, great question. Twitter is the easiest way to follow what we do. It's at GargLab. So at GARGLAB. So that's my research lab, and that's mostly run by my students, but occasionally I might post something, but it's mostly run by my group. But you can see different things that are happening in the space of education or on research. So for example, this podcast we can tweet at the time, but that's probably the easiest way to follow what we're doing, social media. And then I also have a website that covers our research and education that can be found online, but it's garg.chem.ucla.edu. But certainly, I hope that people will follow my research lab and stay in touch if there's anything I can do to offer an opinion or advice or to be helpful in some way.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure, Dr. Garg. Thanks for taking the time today.
Of course. Thanks, Yash.
So if you like what you heard so far, go ahead and click subscribe to stay up to date on the Yash and Company podcast. And do make sure to let me know of any thoughts or comments that you might have, and maybe even any suggestions on who to invite to the show next. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this is Yash signing out.